Hello everyone, and welcome to what is going to finally be the last video in our study of the endocrine system. So we've talked about just about all of the endocrine glands that we're going to talk about in this chapter. So we've talked about their normal function, how negative feedback is supposed to work. So let's talk about how things go wrong and what the consequences are. So we've already seen this in a specific case with hypothyroidism and hyperthyroidism, but basically those are examples of what happens when an endocrine gland does not produce the correct amount of hormone. So if it doesn't produce enough, we call it hyposecretion, and when too much hormone is produced, we call that hypersecretion. Now, here is what we need to make sure that we understand. Just because a gland is making too much or too little hormone, that does not necessarily mean that the problem lies in that particular gland. So, for example, just because a patient comes to see you and they've got very, very low levels of thyroid hormone, that doesn't necessarily mean the problem's with their thyroid. We've spent time talking about how the hypothalamus and the anterior pituitary have a lot to say about what the thyroid does or what the adrenal cortex does, right? So it could be the case that the thyroid is just not producing thyroid hormone because the anterior pituitary isn't producing TSH. That's reasonable, right? So whatever the case may be, we need to try to determine where the issue is. Is the issue actually with the thyroid or with the testes or with the adrenal cortex itself? If that's the case, we call it a primary endocrine pathology, meaning that whatever hormone is out of balance, whether there's too much of it or too little of it, a primary endocrine pathology means that the problem, the defect, is specifically in the gland that produces that hormone. If we've got a secondary pathology, that means that the problem isn't with the thyroid or with the testes or ovaries or with the adrenal cortex itself. The problem is in how the hypothalamus or pituitary regulate that gland, meaning that we've got either too much or too little releasing hormone, too much or too little trophic hormone. So if there's too much or too little trophic hormone, well, naturally, whatever thyroid hormone or testosterone or estrogen, naturally, those are going to be out of balance as well. At that point, it's basically the thyroid is just doing what it's told. The ovaries are just doing what they're told, right? So we've already seen several times what the consequences are of a particular gland being over or understimulated. So if an endocrine gland is being understimulated, it loses cell mass and it goes into what we call atrophy. And on the other hand, if a gland becomes overstimulated, then it is going to grow in size and hypertrophy. So what we're going to do here is we're going to look at three specific examples, and I am going to try and train you in pinpointing where a particular pathology lies. So for all three of these examples, we are going to look at the hypothalamus, anterior pituitary, adrenal cortex axis. So we're talking about the production of the hormone cortisol. Now, hypo and hypercortisolism produce very specific symptoms. So in this case, we are going to assume hypercortisolism. So you're going to see things like excess weight loss, you're going to see inflammation of the skin, you're going to see a lot of things that scream hypercortisolism. So if a patient comes to see you and they present outward symptoms that just scream hypercortisolism, you don't necessarily just want to run off into the distance screaming that there's something wrong with this person's adrenal cortex. We don't know that just yet. So we need to pinpoint where the problem is. So the way I like to do this is the first piece of information you need to know is you need to know the relative levels of all three hormones in the chain. Basically, anytime there's a pathology, one of them or all of them or two of them even are either going to be well above the normal range or well below the normal range. You're not really going to see many cases where some of these hormones are within the normal range. When something goes wrong, the whole thing tends to go wrong. So what we're seeing in this case is that we have unusually low levels of CRH from the hypothalamus, unusually low levels of ACTH from the anterior pituitary, and unusually high levels of cortisol from the adrenal cortex. The way I like to do this is I like to start at the very bottom and I start asking questions and I work my way up until I get an answer that is unsatisfactory to the question that I asked. So I'm going to start at the bottom here. So we have a patient that came to see us. They're just brimming with hypercortisolism symptoms. So we do their blood work and we get these results: low CRH, low ACTH, and high cortisol. So start at the bottom. Start with the adrenal cortex. Okay, cortisol levels are very high. What would explain cortisol being very high? What causes the adrenal cortex to produce cortisol? Well, it's ACTH from the anterior pituitary that causes the adrenal cortex to produce cortisol. Okay, so if cortisol is very high, then that could possibly be explained by there being a lot of ACTH. Is there a lot of ACTH? Goodness no, there is actually a very low amount of ACTH. So right away, this tells us that the adrenal cortex is producing a lot of cortisol in spite of not getting instructions from the anterior pituitary to do so. And we can also tell that there's a lot of cortisol because all of that cortisol, via negative feedback, is suppressing the amounts of ACTH and CRH. Basically, that's the body's way of saying, okay, we've already got way too much cortisol. We don't need any more, so definitely we don't want any CRH or ACTH giving us more. So this is how we can tell right away that the problem is primary in nature. The problem is specifically at the level of the adrenal cortex, because that is the level at which we get that dissatisfactory answer. We are producing way too much cortisol in spite of the fact that there is no explanation for that. Basically, we can't justify all that cortisol by saying that there's a lot of ACTH, right? So we can tell right away that the problem here is at the adrenal cortex. Okay, so next example. This time, it's the same sort of thing. Another patient comes to see you with the exact same symptoms of hypercortisolism, except when you do the blood work on this patient, not only is cortisol high, but ACTH is high as well. So again, we're going to start at the bottom, and we're going to ask the exact same question as before. Cortisol is very high. What would explain cortisol being very high? Well, ACTH being very high would explain that. Is ACTH very high? Well, yes, it is. So this is a case where the adrenal cortex is essentially just following orders. It's making lots of cortisol because the anterior pituitary is telling it to make a lot of cortisol, right? That's what ACTH is. ACTH is a message that says, hey, adrenal cortex, you need to make cortisol. So the problem clearly is not in the adrenal cortex this time. It is just doing what it's supposed to. Okay, so we get a satisfactory answer at the bottom level, so let's move up to the middle level here, at the level of the anterior pituitary. Now we ask a new question. ACTH, why is ACTH so high? What would explain ACTH being very high? Well, what could explain that is if CRH is very high. Is CRH very high? No, it is not. It's actually very, very low. So this is the level now where we get our dissatisfactory answer, and this is what causes us to conclude that the problem is secondary in nature, and the problem here is at the level of the anterior pituitary. The problem, as we said before, is not with the adrenal cortex because it's just doing what it's told. The problem seems to be at the level of the ACTH at the anterior pituitary because the anterior pituitary, for lack of a better term, it seems to have gone rogue. It is producing all this tropic hormone despite not getting those instructions from the hypothalamus. And then the fact that cortisol and ACTH are very high via short loop and long loop feedback would explain why CRH levels are so suppressed. And here's our final example. Basically, another patient comes to see you, exact same symptoms as the two patients from before, except this time all three hormones are unusually high. So again, let's ask our questions, and we'll do it a little more quickly this time. Why is cortisol so high? Well, it's because ACTH is so high, so problem doesn't seem to be at the adrenal cortex. Why is ACTH so high? Well, it's because CRH is very high, so this time the problem does not seem to be with the anterior pituitary. Okay, so we get satisfactory answers at the first two levels, so let's move to the top level. CRH, why is CRH so high? Well, CRH being high could be explained by the constant presence of a stressful stimulus, as we said before in our study of the adrenal glands. But that's a little bit hard to assess in this regard. So we can't really conclude just based on that. So the other thing that we can look at is the negative feedback. So CRH should be high in cases when cortisol is low, meaning that we don't have negative feedback, so that should cause the CRH and ACTH levels to be very high. But we do clearly have plenty of cortisol, so this seems to be a failure of negative feedback at the level of the hypothalamus. So there seems to be something wrong with the hypothalamus that is causing the negative feedback to not work, and the hypothalamus continues to make CRH in spite of that. In this particular example, we get an extra bit of context in that there seems to be a tumor in the hypothalamus. And tumors have the tendency to, when they're located next to endocrine cells, they tend to compress those cells and force them to make more hormone than they really should. So that is one possibility here. So this would also be a secondary pathology because the problem is clearly not at the level of the adrenal cortex. So all three of these hormones remain very high because of the failure of negative feedback, and the problem is clearly at the level of the hypothalamus. So hopefully that little exercise that we just went through has given you an appreciation for how you go about trying to determine where a problem is in a hormonal feedback axis that involves the hypothalamus, the pituitary, and some other gland. You need to have the information on all three hormones. If you only have the information on one or two hormones, you're not going to have enough information to make any sort of conclusion. So here are some examples of real-world diseases that are characterized by some misregulation or some defect in the hypothalamic pituitary axis. So Cushing's disease, we deal with excessive ACTH from the anterior pituitary, and that leads to hypercortisolism. So the second example that we went through is a perfect example of Cushing's disease. Addison's disease involves damage to the adrenal glands, and that leads to hypocortisolism. So this would clearly be a primary defect because of damage specifically to the adrenal glands, preventing it from making enough cortisol. Graves' disease has nothing to do with cortisol, it actually has to do with the thyroid. So in this case, the body's immune system actually attacks the thyroid and causes hyperthyroidism. Essentially, the antibodies produced by the body's immune system somewhat simulate the effect of thyroid-stimulating hormones. So with Graves' disease, you kind of expect lots of thyroid hormone, weight loss, maybe some swelling and enlargement of the thyroid. Hashimoto's disease is similar, except you get the opposite effect. The body's immune system attacks the thyroid, damages it, and prevents it from making thyroid hormone. So that's a case of hypothyroidism. In both cases, those would be primary defects. And then acromegaly, which we talked about before in the context of Andre the Giant as a celebrity example, this is the result of excessive growth hormone coming from the anterior pituitary. Now, if you're trying to characterize this as primary or secondary in nature, this is a little bit different because growth hormone is not one of the tropic hormones that stimulates some other gland to make a new hormone. This is kind of the final hormone in the chain, so you could almost consider this to be primary in nature, even though the problem is at the level of the anterior pituitary. So what you might want to do, just to give yourself some practice with all of this, is to, for each of these diseases, try to chart out what you think the relative levels of the hormones in the chain are. So is the hypothalamic hormone high or low? Is the anterior pituitary hormone high or low? Etc., etc. I think that would be good practice for you. All right, so good news, we are finally done with Chapter 17. This is one of, if not the longest chapter that we are going to cover, so I certainly thank you for your attention during the long process. We're finally done with it, so I won't take up any more of your time. I will see you next time when we start talking about the nervous system. Bye-bye.